I am no better than my ancestors. Does anybody here know, just a raise of hands, you don't have to answer, what a prophet is? Yeah? You got an idea? Yeah, great. A prophet has meant different things at different times. During the Hebrew scriptures, a prophet was often something like a political position. Of course, it was not a democracy, so they didn't have to be popular, which is good because they usually were not. But they were advisors to whoever was in charge. In this passage, we have gone from Judges, where judges were the law of the land, and they discerned the law. And the people of Israel said, no, we want kings. Everybody else has kings. We want kings. So now we're in kings. We have kings. We're legit. But we still have prophets. We still have the guidance of the prophets. In today's connotation, we sometimes think of prophets as people who see the future, people who know something that we don't know about what will happen. Something akin to like a fantasy novel, the chosen one is prophesied to do this and do that. But the prophet was so much more than that. The prophet of this time did not just say what was coming. It was more that they said what was happening. They told the truth. The truth was not popular. They said to the kings, you are not doing what God said you should do. You are not taking care of your people. You are loving money more than you are loving each other. And Elijah was one of the last of the great prophets. And in today's reading, he's having a tough time. Despite recently achieving a remarkable victory as God's messenger, he now grapples with the consequences of telling the truth. Victory in God's service is not often represented in the accolades of those in power. Elijah has angered the king's wife, Jezebel. We'll leave aside the connotations, the modern connotations of Jezebel and the gender politics of why she receives all the ire for now. Because our short reading today finds us observing the despair and fatigue of Elijah in the face of her wrath and what it represents. He was not despairing when God said, you need to go prove to this whole community that this Baal isn't real. You need to go prove through miracle that I am God. He didn't despair then. But he despairs now. Now that the people in power are unhappy with him, now that he is not part of community, or so he fears. And he's tired. So he takes a nap. And as he naps, God sends an angel to make him cake and to give him water. Not to take away his isolation, not to eliminate the anger, and certainly not to tell Elijah that his work is done. No, that is not God's way with his prophets. What is done is that Elijah is fed, and Elijah rests, and Elijah is fed again. And then he is sent off to do what he is called to do, to speak truth to God's beloved. A prophet is a gift to us. The truth is a gift to us. It may sometimes seem like a prophet knows the future because the prophet understands what is happening. The prophet knows the truth of the now and knows that if we continue to neglect our people, to not care for one another, bad things will happen. And we don't like to hear that. We don't want to hear the truth that we are not doing enough, that we are not loving well enough. And yet, if we can hear it, as the Ephesian epistle says, with grace, and if we can hear it as an effort to be built up, the resulting gifts are 100-fold. Before I went to seminary, I worked at a place called L'Arche. L'Arche is an international federation of homes that provide intentional community and housing and care for adults with intellectual disabilities. And I lived and worked there for 5 years. And it was a hard job, as many jobs of caregiving are. You are not just giving of your energy, you are giving of your heart. In order to properly care for someone, you have to care about them. You have to invest, you have to be vulnerable. And that is draining in its own way. But they knew this at L'Arche. They knew what a tough thing they were asking people to do. And so they equipped us with tools. And one of the tools that I got early on was this idea of the shallow well and the deep well. Now, the shallow well are our basic needs: food, sleep, water, shade, or shelter, as you might think of it. Everything in life is hard, if not impossible, if you are hungry and tired. Filling the shallow well is essential and yet simple, or at the very least straightforward. You know that if you are hungry, you should eat. You know that if you are tired, you should sleep. If you are starting to smell, you should take a bath. These things are obvious. Now, not everybody has access to those options. And that is why the first thing that Jesus calls us to do, that God calls us to do, is to meet those needs. That is why Elijah is being fed before he has been sent off. Because you cannot do anything well if you are hungry. But today is not about the shallow well, though that is important. And afterwards, we will go to coffee hour and fill that shallow well. Today is about the deep well. When you give from the deep well, it is harder to know how to fill that deep well. Because it's different for each of us what is life-giving. But for the most part, as we explored how to fill our deep wells, I noticed a trend. Most of us were energized, were given life, were given the strength to care for others when we did things in community. So some of us were on a kickball, intramural league, and some of us, I like to call my sister and talk to my nephews. That was the thing that I realized filled my deep well. A more scientific understanding of what I'm talking about might be, I think it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Is that the right word? Okay, cool. The first you must meet these needs in order to meet these needs. Or a political understanding of it is bread and roses. You need both to eat and to have creative, life-giving elements to your world in order to be truly effective. So the shallow well empties no matter what you do. As long as you are alive, you're burning calories, you need to replenish the calories. The deep well requires being part of community to empty, and it requires being part of community to fill. But when you are aware of the emptying and aware of what it takes to fill it, you start to see, like the loaves and fishes, that you start with this shallow well of giving, or this deep well that is limited, and as it is returned to you, the well grows. The gifts you receive are bigger. Elijah's deep well is drained, as is his shallow well. He is tired and hungry. He has been battling. He has triumphed in God's name, and now he is being threatened for it, hated for it. He feels alone and uncared for and unwanted. And then God sends an angel, first to meet the needs of his shallow well, to give him the food and the water that he needs. And once he is rested and fed, a second truth is revealed. The presence of the angel, the act of service from the angel, from God, reminds him that he is not alone. God is with him. A simple cake and some water will not sustain one for 40 days, but community can. Though this reading is short, it is rich in symbolism, for you see the tree Elijah camps under, the broom tree, is not usually a tree that grows in isolation. When I first read this information, I thought that this solitary broom tree was just poetic license, symbol of Elijah's loneliness. And then my husband, who is more practical sometimes in perceiving things, pointed out that if it is not a solitary tree, then it is possible that the same community that has isolated Elijah also cut down all the rest of the trees. He is under a solitary tree because the resources of the land were not treated with respect, just like he was not. They were not treated with love. The same community has driven away all the other prophets, the truth tellers who held them accountable to what they said they believed, to who they said they wanted to be. And we are created to need one another. But it's hard, right? Because then it means to give of that deep well and to not be certain that it will be filled again. But none of us can do any of this alone. Some of us are called to be the truth tellers, others to be teachers, and still others to bake the cake on the rock. So when a time comes when you find yourself alienated from community, or displeased or disappointed in your community, God is there to remind you that you are not alone, with the assurance that no task is impossible and no community beyond salvation. So we listen to the words in the letter to the Ephesians in this early Christian community that shows us that they struggle as much as any of us have with the needs of community, with the balance of community. The letter does not tell us that everybody's going to be nice and polite and well-behaved at all times. They know better. We know better. No, the Ephesians and the letter writer know, as we know, that such a reality is impossible in a community built of the unique children of God. We are going to disagree. We are going to, each of us, want things to be done a certain way. And because of that, we will hurt each other. We will be hurt. But the solution is not to give up on the community, nor is the solution to be silent. Ephesians outlines a second tool that L'Arche gave us: the importance of constructive feedback. Feedback intended to build up with grace. These are not just nice ideas. These are not just aspirations. These are things that we can practice and do. So at L'Arche, they had a policy, a full document on how to give and receive feedback. Step one, I'm going to share this with you because I think it's a helpful tool. But step one is self-examination. Is your shallow well empty? Are you upset with this person because you're hungry, because you're stressed, because you're tired? Are you upset with this person not because they are doing something that is bad for community or harmful or inefficient or ineffective, but because they're just not doing things the way you would do them? So that is step one, to know yourself, to understand your reaction. I am grateful often for the sensation of anger because it tells me that there is more going on than what I think. Anger is almost always a secondary emotion to fear and pain. So what is it that I am fearing, and what is it that I am lacking? Once I know that, then I know if it's something that needs to be said, because we would all be better off if the conversation was had. So that's step one. No easy step. Step two. Well, before I tell you steps two, I want to tell you a story of the time that I had a full breakdown over strawberry jam. At L'Arche, we shared groceries, and peanut butter and jelly is my comfort food. And they kept buying grape jelly, which on a personal level I think is the grossest thing on the planet. But I understand that other people like it, and I'm fine with that. They weren't getting the stuff I wanted. And I was weeping, openly weeping over jam. And it wasn't about the jam, obviously. It was about that my friend was dying. But jam I could control. Nothing I could do about death. But if someone could just buy me some gosh darn jam. So we go to step two. Figured out why I'm upset about the jam. I go to the person who does the grocery shopping and I say, are you in a place to receive feedback? You can't receive, as much as you can't give feedback if you're hungry, you cannot receive feedback if you're hungry, or if you're stressed, or if you're sad. You cannot hear it for anything other than criticism and attack. So you have to ask. If you want to be heard, you have to ask. And then the person might say, no, not right now. And you say, fine, great. When's a good time? Make sure it happens. Don't let it go. If you've gotten this far, you've decided it matters. And if they say yes, then let's do it. So then step 3 is to use I statements. As much as you think you know what is going on, as much as you think you know what the answer is, there is more to the story. So you must be able to go in there and say, I think this, I feel this, when you did this, I felt this. The impact of your actions, I observed to be this. Share impact. Don't just say, I didn't like it when you did this. Say, I didn't like when you spoke for my friend who can't speak for himself. And that impact limits his already limited agency. And we here are called to liberate that person's agency, to raise up that person's agency at large, but also, in life. And then finally, action steps. The reason I am telling you this process is because I have seen it change lives. There was a time at L'Arche where we were understaffed, where the people we were taking care of were declining rapidly, and we had to move them from the house they had lived in for 35 years to an apartment. And we were all not doing well, and we were upset. And there were 2 people of the 3 people working at that time who did not get along. And one of those people was me. And we just, did not talk. We did not understand each other. And so one day, after a particularly bad time of work together, we met and we had this conversation. And it turned out that we preferred receiving feedback differently. I generally, not always, like feedback immediately. I've been hurt in situations in where people didn't tell me what they were thinking. He had been hurt in situations where people were constantly telling him what he was doing wrong. So he couldn't have feedback right away. He needed a structured time. So we established how we were going to give and receive feedback to each other. We also established that we needed to check in. Anytime we were working together, we would take 5 minutes and say, this is how I feel today. This is how I feel today. So that he'd know if I was short with him, it was because I hadn't slept that night, because I was tired, not because I didn't like him. And those were our action steps. And eventually we didn't have to check in because we were friends. And we knew what was going on in each other's lives. He's still a good friend of mine to this day. And an Episcopal priest, interestingly enough. So they taught us this system. They told us to do it. And you know what they did then? They made us role play it. They made us stand in front of everybody and practice these skills. Raise your hand if you wish you got to do that. It's not fun. It's awkward and weird. And you gotta do it. You gotta do it. If someone's asking you to role play something to learn a skill, particularly a communication skill, you gotta do it. Because if it's awkward when we're doing it and it's not real, can you imagine how awkward it is when we're doing it when the stakes are high? So, That's how we give and receive feedback. There are other additional qualities that Ephesians mentions with grace. So part of giving feedback with grace is not making assumptions. We all do it, but at the very least, know that you're making the assumptions. It sounds awful and uncomfortable and weird, I know. And it is. But I have seen it work miracles. This is an example of giving from the deep well that almost immediately leads to the replenishment of the deep well. Because it leads to a community that is healthy, a community where everyone's needs are met. A community that is healthy requires fidelity, requires accountability, celebration, and hospitality. Without all four, we will drive each other away. And it requires grace and forgiveness. And then we can be transformative. We can be people sustained by the bread of life, full in body and spirit. Jesus in the gospel today is continuing to drive home that the way community and relationship is done can feed our soul as much as it can feed our body. When he says that we can only come to God through him, he is talking about the way that he loves. We come to God through loving the way that Jesus loved, through loving with the truth, through loving with compassion, through loving over and over again, no matter how many times we're disappointed, through spending time with people that don't make any sense to us, to people who are doing things we think is wrong, and loving them anyways. If we come together with our ordinary gifts that Liz so eloquently and powerfully named, and when we share those gifts with one another, they become something extraordinary. To be clear, that sentence is a gift of Liz's wisdom. When we achieve those extraordinary gifts, and the deep and the shallow wells are filled, and we are finally together in community, then we will never be hungry again. Amen.